Birinci konuşmacımız Profesör Guillermo Zavala. Is this correct pronunciation for your name? Guillermo Zavala. Please. Profesör Zavala kendisine çok kısa bir tanıtım yapacak. Please introduce yourself very briefly. It is not working.
Good morning. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the organizers of this meeting for your kind invitation to be here today to speak to you about avian influenza first, and then infectious laryngotracheitis. Okay, 40 minutes.
Just for your talk, 15 minutes discussion.
Very good. Keeps me in line. Just a couple of minutes about myself. I have worked in private industry with broiler production. I've worked for a breeding company, a genetic selection company. I've worked for 2 vaccine companies and a diagnostic laboratory as well. In the last 11 years of a formal job for me, I was a professor and researcher at the University of Georgia, where I did teaching, research, and clinical service for the poultry industry of the state of Georgia and the United States. And with that said, I'm going to speak to you about avian influenza in enzootic areas. I will not make a description of the current outbreaks. There's plenty of information everywhere about avian influenza, and I will just make the primary goal of this presentation is to present to you some important differences between countries that do eradicate avian influenza and what it takes, and also contrasting with countries that cannot eradicate avian influenza and pretty much accept to live with the disease as an enzootic problem. So with that said, the most important topics to cover in this presentation, I'll talk briefly about the current scenario, the distribution of avian influenza in nature, the contributing risk factors, which are many, but I will point out some of the most important ones, some key aspects of the biology of avian influenza virus in wild birds, and then at the end I will concentrate on success stories and failure stories as far as industry goes in different parts of the world. So, okay, I don't know what happened.
Bir teknik arıza var zannedersem.
Okay, well, since most of you understand this and not that, I will continue on. Okay. All right. So basically, this graph summarizes one of the main reasons why we all started worrying about avian influenza deeply in the early 2000s with the advent of H5N1 in both poultry and in humans, and the fear of a human pandemic. And from then on, we have been on high alert throughout many years. I don't intend for you to be able to read the small letters in these tables, but this is to illustrate that between the years 2010 and 2017, there have been at least 65 countries that have reported highly pathogenic avian influenza, both H5 and H7, in, again, 65 countries. So we all would agree that this is without precedent, one of the biggest forms of avian of animal disease that has occurred in recent history. If you want to look at the distribution of highly pathogenic avian influenza, one of the first things that comes to our attention is primarily the distribution. If you look at, this is the equator, the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, and for the most part, you can see that most of the outbreaks recorded for H5 and H7, and those are highly pathogenic, here I'm excluding low pathogenic avian influenza, tend to concentrate in the northern hemisphere, not necessarily in the southern hemisphere, and that's an interesting observation. Now, when we talk about disease, we always talk about the etiology, the pathogenesis, the diagnosis, the general characteristics of each one of these diseases that we are concerned about. But when it comes to really controlling disease and preventing and even eradicating disease, it's very important to think about all the factors that come into place. I was very interested in listening to the first presentations this morning because really your problems as a Turkish industry are very universal. Every country I visit, and I've visited 56 countries by now, every country has very similar problems. And most of our problems drive our daily activities. So if you want to look at disease control as a whole and what it takes to really prevent, control, and eventually eradicate, you have to look at many different factors. For example, poultry genetics, governance, politics, unfortunately, is very important for how we control or don't control disease. What kind of infrastructure we have in our poultry operations, that determines how disease is going to be manifested in the field. What management practices, feeding practices, commercialization practices. Today, for example, it was mentioned that more than 90% of your industry is fully integrated and you sell your products already processed. Many countries around the world sell 40, 50, 60, 80% of their output in the wet markets. And when you have situations like that, it's virtually impossible to control diseases such as velogenic Newcastle or avian influenza as examples. Veterinary care and the quality of veterinary care is very, very important. One of the speakers this morning made a pledge and a plea for you to provide veterinary professionals that do spend time in the field and not so much in the office. I couldn't agree more with that. It's very, very important that the new professionals do spend time working with the chickens in the chicken houses and getting interested in production systems. Otherwise, it's very difficult to understand our mission out there in the field, and so on and so forth. I cannot go through any more details. But one of the most important things that I want to underline today when it comes to lack of control of disease, including avian influenza, is governance. Now, we can define governance in many different ways, but as defined by the World Bank, governance consists of the traditions and institutions by which authority in a country is exercised. This includes the process by which governments are selected, monitored, and replaced, the capacity of the government to effectively formulate and implement sound policies, and the respect of citizens and the state for the institutions that govern economic and social interactions among them. This is really very key. Many of the countries that I visit personally and that are unable to control avian influenza and other diseases, they really don't have a very good political structure that is conducive to effectively control disease. There's no enough infrastructure, as you will see later, to test for disease, to do monitoring or surveillance, and there's also no resources or discipline to effectively control outbreaks of disease, not just of avian influenza, but many others. So that's a very important aspect. This graph, which is produced by Oxford University Press, is basically a summary of rankings of different countries and their ranking in terms of governance. In other words, how well these countries are governed individually. And the ones that I highlighted in green happen to be countries that tend to eradicate avian influenza very effectively. Sometimes it takes a little time, sometimes it takes more time, but eventually they eradicate avian influenza. The countries in black are countries that don't apply because avian influenza has not been detected in those examples. And the countries in red happen to be countries that live with avian influenza and have been unable to control the disease. And eventually, they have to learn how to live with this disease as an enzootic problem. So what are the key elements for low pathogenic avian influenza? Up to this point, I've mentioned different things that apply to highly pathogenic avian influenza or low pathogenic avian influenza. But now I'm going to concentrate on low pathogenic avian influenza. There might be a seasonal it might be a seasonal disease in certain areas. I'll give you an example of Mexico, which is a country where I spend a lot of time, just naturally because of proximity. Mexico suffers from both highly pathogenic and low pathogenic avian influenza. And we do know that from the months of May through September, these are months for velogenic Newcastle. The rest of the year, there are months for low pathogenic and highly pathogenic avian influenza. So that's an interesting observation. There are alternating Newcastle and other avian influenza subtypes in those areas. Broilers tend to be affected mostly when it comes to avian influenza of low pathogenicity. Broilers tend to be affected primarily as a bad case of bronchitis, if you will. And that you have experienced, for example, with H9 in your region. You know, that tends to be a respiratory disease that causes economic losses, but it's not catastrophic as highly pathogenic avian influenza would be. The type of commercialization and production systems also have to do a lot with how we deal with avian influenza. There are countries that practice thinning or selling of flocks in different stages. They'll grow the birds to about 36 days, sell the females, and then keep the males up until a certain age. And every time this happens, there's an opportunity for infection of the farms. The growth of mixed poultry. In the state of Georgia, where I live, we have grandparents, broiler breeders, multiplier flocks, broilers, processing plants, rendering plants, quail facilities, layer facilities. There's a lot of mixture of different kinds of birds. And every time you have a different mixture of types of birds in a particular geographic area, it becomes more difficult to control most of poultry diseases. There's some other examples. For example, in Africa or in South America, old hens, spent hens, have a very high value. For us in the United States, we probably will get 5 to 10 cents of a dollar for one hen at the end of its production cycle. In countries like Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, a producer can get up to $4 per spent hen. So it's very tempting for those people to sell 1,000 chickens today, 5,000 chickens tomorrow, and every time we do this, we allow trucks and crates to come into our facility, potentially contaminating the facility with Newcastle or avian influenza or other pathogens. And then, as a last item in this slide, is poor compliance, live bird transportation. Many of these countries that have enzootic avian influenza, they do have rules, they have laws that prevent the transportation of infected birds or contaminated manure. But still, local industry finds a way to transport contaminated birds and contaminated manure, which contributes to the perpetuation of avian influenza in their regions. So again, in broilers, we tend to see, with low pathogenic avian influenza, primarily an upper respiratory disease and not necessarily systemic. And when it comes to breeders and layers, the main economic losses are associated with drops in egg production and to some extent mortality. That's a very simplified version of what actually happens with low pathogenic avian influenza in enzootic countries. So how does industry cope with low pathogenic avian influenza in countries that do not have the capacity to eradicate effectively avian influenza? Logically, a very important tool for them is going to be vaccinations. And you're going to be very surprised to hear this, but there are countries and there are areas where commercial layers can be vaccinated up to 6 or 8 times against a particular subtype of avian influenza. Sometimes these same hens might be vaccinated up to 12 times for velogenic Newcastle. And interestingly, wherever you have avian influenza, very commonly you will have also velogenic Newcastle in the same facilities, or in the same geographic areas. And when it comes to broiler vaccinations, it is very common to see the use of recombinant vaccines, particularly those that express H5 subtype as an insert in recombinant products. And many of these countries also use kill vaccines at the hatchery, which are basically giving in volumes of 0.1 to 0.3 milliliters per bird at the hatchery. Many of them, if the country happens to produce a very heavy broiler, heavy meaning 60, 75, up to 75 days of age, very, very heavy birds, 4.5 kilograms, then they might vaccinate the birds in the field one more time at 14 to 20 days of age. Now, what you're looking at here on the English screen, those are clinical signs of H5N2 in broilers, relatively young, less than 14 days of age. And those viruses have been subtyped and classified as low pathogenic avian influenza. But if you look at the mortality charts, that doesn't necessarily go with low pathogenic. They can easily get complicated with E. coli and other bacteria, not to mention mycoplasma, and the clinical signs speak for themselves. Even though these viruses are classified as low pathogenic avian influenza, the economic losses can be quite substantial. When it comes to avian influenza in commercial layers, and here I'm going to make the contrast with highly pathogenic H7N3, commercial layers that have been vaccinated 3 to 4 times against H7N3, and then you can see that the flocks still come in production late because of so much manipulation and so many injections with kill vaccines. The flocks really never peak in production. Production drops after exposure to avian influenza virus in the field, and then no recovery ever during the lifetime of that flock. At the same time, we have high mortality, very large proportion of broken eggs, and a very large proportion of eggs that are produced without a viable shell. And therefore, those eggs cannot be marketed. They cannot be used for commercial purposes. Now, going back to low pathogenic avian influenza, we normally don't think about H1N1. H1N1 is really a pathogen that is shared by, for example, turkeys, swine, and humans. And this is a chart from one of the outbreaks that I've had the opportunity to work with in South America, in Chile, where it was documented that a worker that was working as an inseminator of breeder hens was sick when that person was infected with H1N1, infected hens in a particular company, and the hens did not experience any mortality, but you can see the impact in drops in production. Now, that country that was affected is a heavily exporting country, and you can start imagining the consequences when it comes to international trade. Now, the risk of avian influenza will always be there. Many people, surprisingly, during the outbreak that was so severe in the United States, in Minnesota and Iowa and other states, actually 21 states, stood up and said many times that avian influenza, the origin of these viruses is not wild birds. If it's not wild birds, I don't know what the origin of these viruses is. What I think is important to understand is not to point fingers at wild birds, but understand that this is part of their ecology, that the risk will always be there, and that we need to be prepared adequately to prevent infection or contamination of our premises in commercial poultry production. Once these viruses are introduced into commercial poultry operations, it is us as people and with vehicles and fomites and equipment that are in charge of spreading avian influenza viruses when we don't have the proper biosecurity measurements. Now, this video is very interesting, and you have produced some in your area, particularly in Central Europe, where it has been very well documented what species of wild birds migrate, what are the migration routes, and therefore what are the geographic areas at risk. And we have exactly the same situation in the American continent. And if you pay attention closely to the migration patterns of these birds that have been marked, you can see that most of the concentration of these birds tends to be in North America. The breeding grounds are almost always in North America. It is the young birds that are the ones that carry the highest concentration of virus in their digestive tracts. And as they start migrating to the south, when they have not established proper immunity to reduce virus replication and shedding, they migrate towards the south therefore potentially spreading viruses. And that tends to happen in our geographical area around the months of February through May. So that is, for us, the highest risk. Now, this is a little bit theoretical and speculative, but if you look at how land mass is distributed throughout the world, 65% of the land mass concentrates in the northern hemisphere, and the rest of it concentrates in the southern hemisphere. Even though birds need the air to fly, they also need the ground to breed and to graze and to do all the things that they do biologically. So that's another explanation of why probably we tend to have more problems in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere. Certainly, avian influenza is not exclusive to the northern hemisphere. I had the opportunity to conduct an interview to Dr. David Stalneck, who is a worldwide renowned expert in wildlife and avian influenza, one of many that work in this field. And I did this for a regional magazine that is distributed in Latin America. And some of the highlights of this interview that he has concluded, and others, is that the breeding grounds tend to occur in the north, and therefore we tend to have more problems in the northern part of the continent. There's a higher virus concentration in the north. Juvenile birds carry more virus. Juvenile birds may take longer to develop immunity before migration to the south, and as they migrate to the south, they carry more virus than when they migrate towards the north. There's a highest risk with species that fly inside the continent. What are the main wild species that tend to fly within the continent, as it happens in Europe? It's primarily ducks. Those are the most dangerous ones for us. It's not necessarily the shorebirds, which carry also a variety of different viruses of avian influenza, but those tend to be away from where we do commercial poultry production. And so on and so forth. Those are probably the most important aspects. I wanted to show you this chart because it's very important for us to think about how outbreaks could start in the future. As we are being forced to take hens out of cages, as it has become more popular to have small household operations that are not properly regulated, as it was mentioned this morning, and we have less control, we'll have more of an opportunity for avian influenza viruses to contaminate non-commercial poultry or backyard chickens or small flocks that are not properly regulated. If you look at this table summarizes the first 15 out of 224 cases of a highly pathogenic avian influenza in the United States and Canada. It summarizes only the first 15 cases. And what I want you to look at is what kind of birds were the very first cases in this enormous outbreak. Non-commercial, non-commercial, non-commercial, non-commercial, commercial turkeys. Non-commercial, commercial chickens. And then we lost 48 million birds in this outbreak, okay? So we have to take this in consideration. I'm not opposed to people growing chickens in the outdoors, but we have to understand the risks and what the potential consequences are. So as far as risks and requirements, exposure to wild birds is naturally one of the very first things we have to think about. Lack of biosecurity that is designed to prevent avian influenza. I worked for a breeding company for years in the 1990s, and my concepts of biosecurity have changed dramatically. At the time, I had to wash, disinfect, and take 3 showers before I could look at the first pedigree chickens in the company that I was working for. Today, that would be completely insufficient. You have to think about not a farm as an epidemiological unit. You have to think about a chicken house as an epidemiological unit and treat that individual chicken house as if it was one individual farm. You cannot transfer it, you cannot transit or walk or move from house to house within a farm just because you already took a shower and changed your clothes and footwear and are wearing gloves. You have to treat every farm or every house as if it was an individual farm. Lack of adequate infrastructure. You know, many countries don't have the laboratories, the reagents, the personnel, the monitoring, the contingency plans, and the funding that is required to control effectively avian influenza. And then we have to have adequate collaboration between stakeholders. It is absolutely critical, and I think Many of our European colleagues will agree with this. Many in North America will agree with this. Many in Australia, for example, that you have to have the collaboration very harmoniously between industry, government, academia, state laboratories. If each one of these entities does their own job independently and without communicating and working with our counterparts in other disciplines, then it's very difficult to control a disease. We have to work together at all levels. This graph illustrates, is very similar to what you're seeing right now in Europe, but it illustrates the number of cases recorded per week from the beginning of our outbreak of 2014 to 2015. And you can see that there are weeks where we had 34, 31, 36 cases per week. So in order for us to confirm 36 cases in a week, it means we had to test a lot more. And so we have to think about the infrastructure we have to have in the lab, the trained personnel, reagents, funding, people in the field, lots of things logistically that are very, very important to come up with being able to detect timely and to be able to eliminate infected flocks as quickly as possible. So some of the basic requirements for eradication include, one of them is good governance, as I mentioned first. Another thing that is very critical is that the countries that are able to eradicate are typically countries that do have a system for indemnification. Countries that don't have any funds to indemnify producers and that demand from them to eliminate 40, 30, 50% of their production, they're pretty much asking them to go bankrupt and disappear from the poultry industry. So it's very important to have some form of indemnity or to have some form of financial aid or loans to help companies to survive in the event of avian influenza. Another thing that's critical is to have industry preparation and organization. I think we all understand the risks of avian influenza. We understand that it can be a catastrophic disease, but not many companies everywhere in the world have a specific written plan, a contingency plan that spells in detail, if this happens, this is the person in charge. If this happens, this is the equipment that we have to have available for controlling the disease. This is the number of hours or days that we're going to have a complete stop of industry. And this is the people that have to communicate. If we don't think about all those things, it's very difficult and it becomes very theoretical, controlling disease, and so on and so forth. And then, in the end, we have to have deep knowledge of avian influenza and avian influenza virus. How does it survive? How does it spread? How do we diagnose it? How does it mutate? How often we have to update our reagents in the laboratory? And all these things are very important. Other basic requirements for control. We have to have rapid and accurate detection methods. Typically, they have to be able to detect a suspect infected flock within 24 to 48 hours. If we learn two incredibly important lessons in the United States from our big outbreak, one of them is that we have to be able to detect infection within 24 to 48 hours. If we don't do that, we allow the virus to spread exponentially without us knowing that. And the second important thing, among many other things, but the second very important thing we learned is that once we have documented that a farm has been infected with avian influenza, we have to be able to depopulate that farm also within a very short period of time. Now, I gave a similar talk in Denmark not too long ago. And Denmark, if I remember correctly, has probably 5 or 7 million layers in the entire country. So for them, it's a little difficult to understand our situation, where we have companies or farms where we might have 12 million layers in just one farm. And it's overwhelming to try to cope with disease when you have such volumes of birds. And here, one of the messages that I would like to leave is that we have to think about the future. How do we want to continue growing? Is the idea of building multi-age complexes, larger and larger complexes, is that the way to go for the future? It is a very good economic model because it allows us to produce everything locally and process eggs locally. But when it comes to disease, it's a disaster. It's not the way to go. Farms should not be too large because they become impossible to control as far as disease. Biosecurity, quarantine and paralysis for 72 hours, I mentioned that. We all know that vehicle cleaning and disinfection is absolutely critical. Control by area and risk. We normally think about wild birds and people and vehicles and personnel, but we don't think about insects and rodents. They also play a role. I encourage you to read a little bit, just a little bit about the biology of flies, the biology of mice, and the biology of rats. They have the ability to migrate at least 600 meters. So when we depopulate a farm and when we empty a farm, they will migrate to the next farm. If there's a farm in the close vicinity, they're going to go there and they can potentially bring pathogens, not only avian influenza, but any other pathogens of importance. And then finally, as a last resort, is vaccination. That is being used as a permanent tool in countries that do have avian influenza as an enzootic problem. It's not the right thing to do. It's not the right way to go. And the reason why these countries have become so tolerant to avian influenza is simply because of lack of funding. It's lack of resources. But they would like to get rid of avian influenza. They just can't. It's very difficult. Once you reach a critical mass, it's easy to eradicate by depopulation when you have 1 farm or 2 farms or 5 farms. But when 40% of the national production is contaminated with avian influenza or another pathogen of that nature, it becomes unsustainable. You can't just eliminate millions and millions of birds in a country that doesn't have the resources to do that. So they resort to vaccination. In the United States, there's a national program, and then every state has an individual program. I will share with you how avian influenza is viewed within the state of Georgia, which is the largest poultry producing state in the nation. We produce about 9 billion broilers per year. We have about 12 million layers, and we have about, I would say, 8 to 9 million broiler breeders plus other birds. So in the state of Georgia, it is a scalable event. If we have low pathogenic avian influenza, H5 or H7, it is industry that deals with the problem. If we have H5 that is not H5 or H7, if it is low pathogenic H5 or H7, then the state authorities have to get involved. If it happens to be highly pathogenic H5 or H7, it is the United States Department of Agriculture at the national level that has to get involved. We lose all jurisdiction locally with our local labs, the local universities, etc. If it happens to be a type of influenza that infects humans, then all the agricultural sector loses jurisdiction, and it is the human health authorities that have to get involved. So depending on what the situation is, there is a plan for low path that is no H5 or H7. There's a plan that is H5 or H7 low path. There's a plan for highly pathogenic, and there's a plan for zoonotic avian influenza. And that's also important to keep in mind. Now, after our outbreak of 2014-15, the United States Department of Agriculture came up with this essential sequence of events, and that summarizes very, very well how we are prepared now compared to what we were only 2 or 3 years ago. First, we have to be able to detect the virus as quickly as possible, quarantine the facilities. We have to be able to appraise the facilities. Every single farm has to be localized by GPS such that a government official can quickly access the farm and evaluate the inventory of birds and give it a price. This is how much the birds are worth, and this is going to be your indemnification value for your farm or your company. Then compensation ensues. How do we manage disposal? All of this, every single individual item has to have a plan. How do we eliminate the virus from the contaminated facilities? How do we test and demonstrate that there's no more virus in the facilities? How do we restock when the farms or the companies are given permission to repopulate the previously affected farm, and then how do we maintain biosecurity. So for all of that, there's an hour of discussion that we could do, but those are the essential steps. So I'm getting closer to the end. I'd like to make a little bit of a contrast between success stories and failure stories. So we have to look at different things such as geography, monitoring systems, diagnostics, quarantine, depopulation, and other factors. So the countries that have been able to successfully eradicate are the ones that have an intensive monitoring system, have a high capability for diagnostics, not just one national lab that is unable to handle many samples. We have to be able to quarantine facilities effectively. We have to be able to dispose very quickly of the birds that have been contaminated. As I mentioned before, countries that do have a compensation system tend to be the countries that also are able to eradicate effectively. We have to be able to eliminate the virus that contaminated premises or flocks. And after that, or permanently, we have to have an intensive testing scheme.
5 minutes left.
Okay, 5 minutes? All right. So that and many other things. So is it because of wild birds exclusively? Or is it because of how we grow chickens? Or is it because of the infrastructure? If you look at that video on the left, that is in the province of Guangdong in China. And how many of these birds are marketed. The birds are brought by many different producers to a local wet market where they are slaughtered on site, picked up by the customer, and eventually they're sold. And if you look at also the type of facilities, cage facilities, where a lot of the birds are left for up to 2 years in one particular farm, accumulating manure in this fashion, you can start imagining how difficult it is to control any disease, let alone avian influenza. So critical factors in enzootic areas. I will mention only 7 most important factors. 1, the monitoring systems that we have, the production and commercialization systems, live bird and manure handling and transportation, compensation, vaccines and vaccination, the local ideology or idiosyncrasy in wild bird surveillance. I will not have the time to cover each one of these, but I will mention just a couple of things before I finish. First of all, as you very well know and understand, we have to have very effective monitoring systems that truly cover our farm production. In our area, in the United States, for example, we don't have a perfect system. It's very far from perfect, and therefore we do have outbreaks. But we are not allowed to send any birds to the processing plants without having them tested. Every single flock of birds that is being sent to the plant has to be tested for avian influenza within 7 days prior to slaughter. What methods do we use? We use serology, and more companies are using exclusively molecular detection methods, because we have also learned that for this and other diseases, that if we only use serology, we might miss an infected flock. It takes them several days, sometimes a little longer, for them to seroconvert and produce detectable antibodies, and therefore we now use more and more molecular detection methods. Production and commercialization systems. I mentioned this as an important risk factor in countries or areas where spent hens have a very high commercial value, and they're not sold in one single action. They're sold in multiple different stages. Number 3, live bird and manure handling and transportation. If we don't have rules and respect rules in terms of transportation of contaminated manure, and without treating that manure, or without any discipline in transporting infected birds, then we are moving millions of birds and putting many more millions of birds at risk. Compensation, absolutely critical if we want a program to be successful. Number 5, vaccines and vaccination. That is the last resort that countries have resorted to. and some of the countries that have successful programs. Italy is one example. The United States also has vaccinated for avian influenza successfully, especially for low pathogenic avian influenza, particularly in turkeys and commercial layers. Local idiosyncrasy. What I mean by that is that it is very important to provide continuing education to producers, local veterinarians, diagnosticians, academia, and create as much awareness as possible to try to prevent introduction of avian influenza. And finally, it's very important also to have a wild bird surveillance systems, because that is one form of evaluating the potential risk of contamination of the commercial populations of birds. Naturally, if you detect highly pathogenic or low pathogenic avian influenza in wild birds, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to have a problem, but it should serve as an alert system for anybody or any country or any region to be aware of the fact that H5N8 or H5N2 or H7N3, whatever virus is circulating in the area, and then everybody needs to step up their biosecurity as much as possible. And with that, I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for the invitation again, and thank you very much for your attention.
Profesör Zavala'ya bu güzel konuşmasından, çok net anlaşılabilir konuşmasından dolayı teşekkür ediyoruz. Şimdi bir 15 dakika soru cevap süremiz var. Soru sormak isteyenlere seyyar mikrofonlar sağlanacak. Var mı soru sormak isteyen? Soru sormak isteyen var mı? You want microphone?
No, I want translation.
Ya, headphone, not the microphone. Kulaklık istiyor arkadaşlar. Bir tane kulaklık getirelim lütfen. Sorular bitince sana vereceğiz. Onu da Ruta verin. Var mı soru sormak isteyen? Parmaklar. Evet hocam, buyurun.
Öncelikle konuşmanızdan dolayı teşekkür ediyorum. Bazı ülkelerde Avrupa Birliği gibi aşı kullanılmamasını, bazılarında da kullanmasını konusunda yorum yapar mısınız? Teşekkürler.
Konuşmacılar da kendilerini tanıtsınlar efendim. Hocam tanıtın kendinize.
Hüseyin Yılmaz, İstanbul Üniversitesi Veteriner Fakültesi Viroloji Anabilim Dalı.
Okay, I don't want to speak for every country, but I'm going to speak from experience. Part of the reason why, for example, the European Union, North America, Australia, do not have tolerance for avian influenza is because of the risk of a pandemic. That's one reason. And therefore, we prefer to depopulate and not to vaccinate. The second reason is a commercial reason. Many countries that are exporting countries, they cannot vaccinate and export. International trade, as it is today, international trade is not compatible with vaccination. When we had our outbreak of avian influenza, the United States consulted with many of their trading partners and asked the specific question: if we decide to vaccinate, will you take our product? 100% of them said no. So it is also a very important reason not to vaccinate. Now, why countries decide to vaccinate? Because they probably don't have the resources or the infrastructure necessary to eradicate, and they probably don't have, again, the economic resources, or they simply do not export. And for them, it is a viable solution to vaccinate against avian influenza. There's always a tendency of some sectors of industry to want to vaccinate to solve their immediate problems. But I can tell you that long-term, mid-term, and long-term is not the way to go. Vaccination, whether it's with recombinant and or with kill vaccines, does not prevent infection. It still allows vaccinated birds to get infected. The virus still replicates. It still causes some mortality and production losses, and it will still be shed and potentially be spread to other birds or premises or farms. So there's many reasons why countries vaccinate or do not vaccinate. Those are some of the most important ones that I can think of.
Teşekkür ediyoruz. Bir soru daha var. Lütfen mikrofon gelmeden konuşmayalım. Kendinizi önce bir tanıtın. Kaan Bey.
İsmim Kaan Çubukçu. Ben öncelikle bu güzel sunum için Profesör Doktor Zavala'ya çok teşekkür ederim. Kendisini zaten takip ediyoruz. Benim sorum, açıkçası iki sorum var. Birincisi, Amerika Birleşik Devletleri'nde kuş gribini, Avian influenza'yı daha çok ticari yumurtacılarda gördük. Ki biliyoruz Amerika Birleşik Devletleri dünyanın en büyük broiler üretici ülkesi. Yani bu farklılığın bilimsel bir sebebi var mı? İkincisi de özellikle sunumunda çok önemli bir konuya temas etti. Bu multi-age sistemler. Yani Türk ülkemizin de bu problemi. Yani bu multi-age sistemler bu değişen hastalık dinamikleri koşullarında çok da fazla efektif görünmüyor anlaşılan. Ya bununla ilgili Amerika Birleşik Devletleri'ndeki herhangi bir tartışma var mı bu sistemle alakalı? Onları öğrenmek istiyorum. Teşekkür ederim.
Okay, why the broiler industry has not been affected is because we have been very lucky. We have 4 primary flyways of wild bird migration routes, and 3 of them have been affected, and 1 of them this time has not. And the flyway that was not affected happens to be where the broiler industry is. Most of the broiler industry is located in the southeastern part of the United States. Most of the layer and turkey industries are located in the north central part of the country. That is one reason, just geographical separation, migratory fowl, and then I have to say that our biosecurity level in the turkey industry and the layer industry is not nearly what it is in the meat-type chicken industry. The meat-type chicken industry has better biosecurity systems. We do not have, even today, after these outbreaks, we do not have what it takes to prevent avian influenza. And proof of that is that we have sporadic outbreaks of mycoplasma. Right now we have multiple flocks in California affected with infectious coryza, which we haven't had in many years. And when you have those diseases, it tells you that you're not prepared to deal with avian influenza in those cases. So geographical separation, migratory fowl, those are very important things. I did not understand the second question. I wonder if it could be repeated, please. It was about mutation.
Mikrofonu verelim.
Sistemlerle alakalı. Siz sunumunuzda bahsetmiştiniz. Yani bu artık sistemlerin bu farklılaşan hastalık koşullarında çok da fazla etkili olmadı, ekonomik olarak etkili olsa da hastalıklar anlamında ciddi bir risk olduğunu söylediniz. Bunun Amerika Birleşik Devletleri'ndeki tartışmalarla ilgili ben soruyorum. Yani bununla ilgili gelecekle ilgili sizin üreticileriniz ne düşünüyor bu tarz üretimle ilgili?
Professor Zavala, how common is the multi-age system in USA?
How common?
How common?
Sure.
I just wonder about the discussion about the multi-age system because you mentioned it is very risky,
yes,
even though it is economically
okay.
positive.
So multi-age, not mutation. Okay.
No, multi-age system, yes.
Okay.
Yes, there are.
Okay, multi-age systems are extremely common, extremely common. I'll give you just a few figures, a few numbers. The largest layer company in the United States has 36 million layers. That's Cal-Maine Foods. The second largest one is Rose Acres. That one has 26 million layers. The next one has about 18 million layers, and so on and so forth. So for them, their economic model through many years has been to grow in what we call inline complexes, where you have multiple houses connected by a belt that goes to an egg processing plant. And from the accounting point of view, it is a very attractive model because you don't have to transport eggs, you don't need trucks, you don't need people, extra people to do that. You can do everything in just one location. And the way these companies have grown has led to the proliferation of many, many multi-age systems. To the extent that we have farms that can have 7 million layers, 8 million layers in one single. To have 7 million layers, you're talking about houses that have an average of 150,000 birds per house to 200,000. So divide 8 million by 150,000, and that gives you the number of houses that you might have in different ages that range between 16 weeks and 120 weeks. So it is extremely common, to be short with my answer. Extremely common.
Teşekkür ediyoruz. Evet, oradan bir soru. Buyurun. Mikrofon elinizde mi?
Elimde.
Tamam.
Hello.
Kendinizi tanıtın.
Hello, I'm Mert Yalçınap.
Türkçe sorun lütfen.
Türkçe mi söyleyeyim? Merhaba, ben Mert Yalçınap, KOP Türkiye Teknik Müdürüyüm. Size AI'ın kalıtım derecesi hakkında ne düşündüğünüzü soracağım. Çünkü yani daha dirençli hayvanlar AI açısından geliştirmek mümkün mü? Çünkü biz genetik firmaları bunu modern broilerler geliştirirken 40'tan 50'den fazla seleksiyon kriteri kullanılıyor. Fakat ne yazık ki hayvanları viral hastalıklar için özellikle selekte etmeye çalıştığınızda bunu yapamıyorsunuz. Çünkü bu challenge'ı vermeniz çok zor yukarıda pedigree aşamasında. Şimdi de bu genomics diye biliyorsunuz, genomics deniyor. Bu genetik gen haritaları kullanılarak hayvanların anaçlarına gidip bunlar daha dirençli hayvanların seçimi üstüne çalışılıyor. Ama bunun daha tabii olmasını hemen bugün yarın değil ama bir süre var. AI'ın kalıtım derecesi bunu yapmaya mümkün müdür? Generasyonlar sonrasında halen daha dirençli hayvanı bulduğunuzda bu çalışır mı sizce?
Are you geneticist?
I'm not a geneticist and I didn't get any translation.
That's why because
Tamam, şimdi İngilizce sorun.
I thought you worked for breeder companies before, yeah?
Yeah, I worked in, I was responsible for poultry health at a breeding company that today is part of your company.
Yeah.
Avian Health, Avian Farms International.
Oh, good. So my question was, you know, there are a concept called genomics, and we are trying to make more resistant birds. But it's very hard to challenge the birds with some viral diseases. In pedigree farms, it's very hard to do it. But with the new gene maps are more clarified now, so it's going to that way, more resistant birds. But I'm wondering about the AI inheritance level. So AI is possible to do this.
Yes, I'm not a geneticist, but I do know that it is possible to increase genetic resistance to avian influenza. But at the same time, I know that when you increase resistance to some viral diseases, including avian influenza, you give up very important genetic traits that are critical for this industry. Unfortunately, and I think your company in particular has been one of the pioneer companies understanding that the most productive way to make more resistant birds is to improve their innate immunity and not their specific acquired immunity to a particular antigen or agent. What I mean by that is that if you make more robust genetic lines of birds that are able to respond very aggressively with non-specific immune responses, innate responses, you can increase your chances of livability and survival and things like that. I'd like to also give you another example. In countries that are chronically affected with avian influenza, in commercial layers, the genetic lines that tend to consume a little bit more, there's some genetic lines, there's some breeds that don't consume as much feed, especially in hot weather. The ones that do tend to consume more feed, they recover much, much faster from outbreaks of avian influenza. And that has been a determining factor for many companies around the world to choose one breed over the other, just how fast they can recover. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're more resistant to infection. They just recover a little bit faster because they consume more feed. But that's what I can tell you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Teşekkür ederiz. Soru cevaplar için maalesef süremiz son derece az. Bir kişiye daha söz verelim. Buyurun. Zafer Bey, lütfen kendinizi tanıtınız.
Zafer Bozdoğan Refarm. Şimdi demin çok yaşlı sistemlerin sakıncasından bahsetmişti. Kaan Bey de bu konuda sorusunu sordu. Ben benzer bir soru soracağım aslında. Çok yaşlı değil de aynı yaşta olup da çoklu kümeslerin olduğu bölgelerdeki tehlike hakkında ne düşünüyor? Yani tek yaşı tek kümes bir alanda değil ama fazla miktarda kümes aynı alanda. Değişen bir şey yok o zaman bu çok yaşlı kümesle aynı yaştaki kümesler arasında.
Tamam. Single age group but several houses.
Single age group?
Single age group but several houses.
Yes.
What do you think about this?
Single age group is always better. Small
but several
farm.
houses in the same place.
Yeah. I mean, that applies to what you do at the farm, and that applies to what you do in the hatchery, for example. You know, as long as you can introduce animals or embryos all at the same time and take every individual all at the same time, then you have an opportunity to clean, disinfect, and terminate whatever disease cycle you might have in there. But when you have multiple ages, the farm is never empty. Or the hatchery, if it is a multi-stage hatchery, it's never empty, and that's not compatible with salmonella control, for example. So it's very important to think about this for the future and how we want to grow as an industry. Single-age facilities, single-stage hatcheries, always a million times better to cope with disease.
Ya ben beklediğim yanıtı tam olarak aldım diyemem Erol Bey. Çünkü tamam bir değişik yaşlardakinde birbirlerine bir risk var ama aynı yaştaki sürülerde de bir enfeksiyon olduğu zaman çoklu olmasının getireceği risk de var.
Tabii bunları biliyoruz yani.
Evet.
Tabii.
O
Şimdi,
zaman o riskten
teşekkür ediyorum sorunuza.
Bir anlam çıktı. Teşekkür
ediyorum. Anlaşıldı. Soru soracak zaman kalmadı. Ben şöyle kısa bir toparlama yapayım. Şimdi Zavala'nın konuşmasından anladığımıza göre kuş gribinin önlenmesi, yayılmasının önlenmesinde, çıkmasının değil, yayılmasının önlenmesinde en önemli silahımız biyogüvenlik. Biyogüvenliği de sektörümüze sorduğumuz zaman herkesin çok iyi bildiği ama hiç kimsenin çok iyi uygulamadığı bir sistem. Böyle devam ettiğimiz sürece kılavuzumuz karga demektir. Bir diğer olay da gene buradan benim toparladığım çok özet olarak biyogüvenliğin çiftlik bazlı değil, kümes bazlı olması gerekiyor bundan sonra. Bir çiftlikte 5 tane kümes varsa bir elbise değiştirip bir biyogüvenlik önlemini aldık, çiftliğe girdiğimiz zaman bütün kümesleri gezmemiz diye bir şeyin söz konusu olmaması gerekiyor. Bu da gene biyogüvenliğin çok hassas noktalarından birisi. Kümes bazlı biyogüvenlik olacak. Tabii en önemli bunun önlenmesindeki konulardan bir tanesi de tazminat meselesi. Bu da tabii ülkemizde çözülmüş bir konu değil. İnşallah bu konuda çözülebilir. Sizin burada birkaç şeyiniz var mı acaba? Mehdi Bey.
Değerli katılımcılar, ben geçen sene Dünya Yumurta Kongresi'ndeki araştırmanın sebeplerini değil yalnız, sonucunu sizinle paylaşmak istiyorum. Çok kısa. Buradaki broiler piliç eti yetiştiren arkadaşlar rahatlamasınlar lütfen. Çünkü bu vereceğim rakam onları biraz sevindirebilir.
Ama şımarmasınlar.
Evet, şımarmasınlar. 2015 yılı dahil avian influenza vakalarının risk gruplandırması yapmışlar. Broiler kümesleri risk grubusunda %3'te. Ticari yumurta kümesleri %17. İşte geliyoruz en büyük problem kısmına. Sayın Tarım Bakanlığı yetkili arkadaşlarımız. %80'i ise ördek, kaz, serbest tavuk ve hindi. Buna herkesin dikkatini çekmek istedim. Teşekkür ederim.